Vice President Dr. Gilbert Llanto, government regulators, colleagues in public service, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning once again. It is my pleasure to keynote this policy dialogue on effective regulations for sustainable growth. First of all, let me congratulate PIDS on the celebration of the 13th Development Policy Research Month and for organizing yet another meaningful dialogue that gathers concerned government agencies to discuss and chew over the value of our existing regulations, whether they are still effective in light of the current global and domestic events affecting our economy. The theme for this policy dialogue, effective regulations for sustainable growth, is very relevant as we gear for regulatory reform. I understand that Dr. Llanto will later present the DPRM theme paper on reducing regulatory burden and improving regulatory quality. Regulations pertain to the legal rules that are intended to discipline individuals and firms' behavior, and which have the following three attributes. They are compulsory, backed by criminal and/or administrative sanctions, and are publicly enforced. To economists, regulation is almost synonymous with government intervention in markets, which means that they should be justified. Economic efficiency is, of course, the normative criterion, even if the goal of regulation is something else. This proceeds from the notion that regulation is not costless. As such, regulation can be economically justified only when it improves market outcomes or corrects one or more market failures, typical of which are lack of competition, informational imperfections, and missing markets. As we only know too well from experience, however, a regulation meant to correct a market failure could lead to a far worse outcome in some situations. Regulatory failure may occur when regulators do not know enough about individuals and firms' behavior to be able to improve market outcomes, even if these are seriously flawed, and respond to the failure of regulation by adding still new regulations instead of repealing failed ones. Of course, a second source of regulatory failure is when lawmakers and bureaucrats pursue their own self-interest or that of the party on whom bureaucrats depend for information. The fact is, regulation is often contested, with public opinion tending to blame regulation or regulators for anything that goes wrong. And the blame can go in either direction, depending upon whether at a certain point in time the market economy is delivering gains or imposing losses on society. On the one hand, markets should be liberalized or deregulated when regulations are seen as restricting opportunities for growth, profit, and well-being. On the other hand, regulation should be tightened when it is perceived to be not doing enough to rein in market forces when social welfare is compromised. Swings between pro-regulation and anti-regulation sentiment are at the heart of the politics of regulatory reform and affect the ability of regulation to actually enhance social welfare. But they also motivate us to come up with effective regulations. During the press briefing after an APEC meeting last week, I was asked how I would characterize the regulatory environment. I said, there have been some gains, but it doesn't mean that there is no more work to do, and that we need to do a better job at that. So let me turn now to effective regulations. Let me start by saying that a lot of initiatives are going on around the globe on good regulatory practice and its role in improving global and regional competitiveness. As I've already suggested, we just concluded the third APEC senior officials meeting and the second APEC structural reform ministerial meeting in Cebu last week. Good regulatory practice, or GRP, frequently came up as a topic of discussion in these two events. A workshop on the methods and methodologies to evaluate the impact of economic regulation was conducted by Mexico's Comisión Federal de Mejora Regulatoria during the third APEC senior officials meeting, while the Department of Trade and Industry Bureau of Product Standards organized the 8th Conference on Good Regulatory Practices. GRP was also part of the SRMM agenda, where ministers and senior officials from APEC economies shared their experiences and views on regulatory reform and cooperation, particularly in relation to the services sector. Prior to the senior officials meeting and the structural reform ministerial meeting, the ASEAN and OECD organized a joint conference last March on GRP, focusing on its relevance to connectivity, competitiveness, and regulatory coherence among member economies. Moreover, the ASEAN integrated regulatory coherence in its economic community blueprint to achieve market integration, as well as address trade and investment issues between and among its member states. Since then, economies such as Malaysia and Mexico have come on board with far-reaching initiatives in regulatory reform. Thailand, on the other hand, has begun reviving its efforts in this area. Some of our neighboring countries have also institutionalized GRP in their system. In this scenario, there is a need for the Philippines to really catch up. The OECD and ASEAN define good regulatory practices as internationally recognized processes, systems, tools, and methods for improving the quality of regulations. GRP provides a system for implementing public consultation and stakeholder engagement and ex-ante impact analysis of proposed regulations to make sure that the desired policy objectives are achieved. The OECD has also presented pieces of evidence that GRP contributed to sustainable economic development as a significant input to structural reforms, liberalization of product markets and competition, international market openness, and business environment for innovation and entrepreneurship. Given that regulation is one of the three anchors or levers, along with tax and spending, that governments draw on to achieve sustainable and inclusive growth, it is imperative for the Philippines to review our regulatory system, assess the environment for institutionalizing GRP, and formulate a regulatory framework to be able to pull alongside other Asian economies, especially now that we are moving towards ASEAN integration. Above all, this will help the government in addressing barriers to cross and behind-the-border trade, which in turn will also boost investments. An effective regulatory environment encourages foreign and domestic businesses to invest in the country. In formulating the regulatory framework, it is important to look at three mutually reinforcing pillars of GRP. First, regulatory policies. Second, regulatory institutions. And third, regulatory tools. These pillars will ensure that the quality of regulations in the country is kept at a high level. The pillar on regulatory policies prompts us to have a clear and transparent whole-of-government approach to link our policies with regulations. The pillar on regulatory institutions, on the other hand, ensures that our regulations are well crafted to address the right policy challenges. The third pillar provides the array of tools such as regulatory impact analysis, administrative simplification, communication tools, non-regulatory options, or market-based approaches, among others, in undertaking GRP initiatives. These pillars have proven to be solid foundations upon which success stories of economies such as Malaysia and Mexico were built in implementing GRP. In the Philippine Development Plan, regulatory reform forms part of strategies to achieve efficient and effective governance. Good governance is one of the platforms or bedrocks that influence the economy's productive potential. Regulatory reform is also outlined in the sectoral chapters of the plan. For instance, in Chapter 5 on Resilient and Inclusive Financial System, the plan calls for the establishment of a regulatory environment that balances financial inclusion objectives with financial stability goals. It also pinpoints the need to strengthen the country's legal framework for promoting competition, not only for the sake of improving competitiveness, but also as a measure to rationalize the prices of commodities. We all know that the competition law was enacted just recently. The approaches to GRP are embedded in the plan, albeit in a fragmented way. In addition, we are currently pursuing transparent and evidence-based regulatory reforms through various initiatives. One of these is through capacity building on regulatory impact assessment in implementing agencies with regulatory functions, such as the Department of Tourism and the Department of Labor and Employment, which are pilot agencies. The National Economic and Development Authority, which is seen to be the oversight agency for reviewing regulations in the country, is also undertaking regulatory impact assessment initiatives, which will be cascaded to the Department of Trade and Industry, the Department of Agriculture, and the Securities and Exchange Commission. Nevertheless, finding the right mechanisms for regulatory reform and institutionalization of GRP remains a challenge in the Philippines. I think that Dr. Liando will provide us a holistic background of regulatory reform in the Philippines and recommendations on improving regulatory quality. At this point, it is important to note that our form of government affects the reform process. The executive, legislative, and judicial branches of government have their roles to play in making regulations effective. Certainly, there is a lot more work for us to do in addressing these challenges and gaps to make our regulations effective and thus improve our regulatory environment. As mentioned earlier, GRP implementation in the country requires a whole-of-government approach. A mechanism for linking policies and programs will pave the way for improved decision-making. This linkage should be supported by institutions that promote good regulatory governance. This means engaging significant sectors of society and establishing systematic consultation mechanisms in the analysis of proposed regulations and even in reviewing outdated regulations. It is also necessary for us to maximize the use of tools, particularly regulatory impact assessment, to ensure transparent and evidence-based regulatory practice. We are fortunate that our development partners, such as the ADB and OECD, continue to provide technical and financial assistance in this area. Let us continue to take these opportunities and avail ourselves of their assistance, especially since we are still in the process of institutionalizing GRP. It is also an opportune time for us to learn from the challenges and success stories of our economy, of other economies, such as Malaysia, Mexico, Singapore, and Australia, in pursuing regulatory reform. In addressing the gaps, we can endeavor to promote regulatory cooperation and coherence, particularly in the services sector, keeping in mind the need to manage the risks of exclusion. In doing this, we must continue to be in the loop as the other economies embark on implementing the renewed APEC strategy for structural reform, which focuses on services, looks at innovation, promotes political will and regulatory cooperation, and underscores the principles of transparency, simplicity, consistency, fairness, and speed of decision-making. To conclude, let me reiterate that there is a need for us to institutionalize good regulatory practices as we move towards ASEAN integration and continued cooperation with several other economies in terms of trade and investment. GRP is one of the critical ingredients in performing structural reform, which is necessary to achieve sustainable and inclusive growth. There will be challenges and difficulties along the way, but there are also opportunities that we can grab to address these challenges. This policy dialogue is one venue where we can bring together and integrate ideas and initiatives amongst government agencies in undertaking good regulatory practice. I hope today's activity will trigger continued regulatory reform efforts to benefit all sectors of society, making our economic growth sustainable and inclusive. Congratulations to PIDS for holding this event, and may we have